I made a table, even though I've never made a table before. I don't have any experience making a table, or woodwork at all, really, for that matter. I mean, like, I've built a couple of scrappy things, but I've never really built a table. I think it went fairly well, but there's a few issues, and I'm going to go over the four sort of things I want to go over in this. I've got the what and why is the table. There's the how I put it together. Then there's going to be the well, what went wrong, what was annoying, what would I want to change if I could. And then I'm going to finish it off with what's going to happen in the future. So, four things. Let's go through them. Okay, so basically just to keep things quick and concise, I need a big table that's on wheels and lives outside with some storage on it. Why? I have a load of tools I can't keep inside and they need somewhere permanent to live. I have no proper countertops that I can just work on willy-nilly. So every time I have to solder anything, I have to do a load of setup and moving around. Every time I do something at my desk, at the green cutting mat, that's my computer desk, which I have to clear off and then put all the computer stuff back on when I'm done with. And if you've ever seen me tinkering with a 3D printer, that's literally just on my bed, which isn't great. So yeah, I just need a table where I can actually do these sort of projects without worrying about the setup and stuff. It's just going to remove a lot of tedium and hopefully improve the quality of my work too. Now let's move on to the actual building of the table. Okay, so the first thing I did was contemplate for a really long time, staring at a pile of wood, thinking. I'd originally planned to have legs, as a table does, and have wooden support thingies that go across. I'll show some sort of visual representation. That then screw into the outside of the legs because it's easy. But my alternate option, instead of the nice easy screw into the outside, was to use dowels into the sides of the legs, which, I mean, considering I'm someone who's never done woodwork before, and definitely not touched doweling before, other than from IKEA furniture, it would have been a challenge, but it would have made my wood go further, and resulted in a much prettier table. So it was do the easy thing that I'd definitely be more capable of, that uses a bit more wood, but whatever, or do the hard thing that I have a much lower chance of being capable of, but makes the wood go further and potentially looks prettier. And I decided to go with option B, the thing that would be too much of a challenge for me to achieve with no practice doing wood stuff. And sure, I could have practiced on some other stuff first, but I didn't want to practice on other stuff first. I wanted to build a table. So you can see the dilemma here. Once I'd decided with that, I basically started out cutting every piece of wood to length. So I had the legs cut first, and then used them to help me determine the size of the front and back long supporting panels, and then cut the side panels to length because I made them a bit shorter than the maximum width so that I could have a lip on the front of the table so I could clamp stuff to it. And once they were cut, I had the incredibly daunting task of cutting about what I originally calculated as 80 dowels. I didn't need that in the end. But yeah, every project I think has this part that's long and tedious and not fun. And for me, I think that was cutting out 80 dowels because it's not a challenge cutting 80 sticks out and rounding the ends. But I pushed through it and did it, even though it was annoying. And so I think I ended up making a jig where I put the long stick into like a little indent, a recess. I'd put in a piece of chipboard with another piece of wood clamped down that gave me the exact length I wanted every time, which I then chopped down with a coping saw. I cut out 80 something of those. I did actually try to do electric stuff with a jigsaw, but it did not end well. Yeah, and then when I cut out all the dowels, there was a horrible rainstorm and I was stuck doing nothing for a couple of days. And then when I came back to it, I put a piece of sandpaper down on a table and clamped it down, and then put every dowel clamped into the chuck of an electric drill, span it round on the sandpaper, and flipped it, and then did it again and put it in a pot to say it was done. And I did that with every single dowel. But once that was done, once I'd finally cut out every single piece of wood and all the dowels, I was able to drill out holes for the dowels to go into in each piece of wood. I did a test piece, because that's sensible to do. I bought 9mm dowel stock, I think. Would you call it dowel stock? I'm not really sure. And so I did an internet search, and they said, drill out a 9mm hole then. So I bought a 9mm bit, and an 8mm bit, luckily. And I drilled a 9mm hole, put the dowel in, and it was loose as heck. And I did some more searching, and they said, well, when you put the glue in, sometimes it makes the fit much tighter. So I tried it with some glue, and still loose. But when I drilled 8mm holes, the dowels went in firmly, and with glue still firmly, and held really well. So I ended up drilling 8mm holes in the end. I think I determined basically it's because I am inaccurate. So I was oversizing the drill holes, and the dowels were undersized from 9mm. So in the end, it just sort of all added up and equalized out. I did use 3D printed jigs that I designed in order to space the dowels perfectly on everything and hopefully keep them aligned. They did wear out towards the end because they're made of plastic. Although I did realize after the fact that I could have actually inserted 8mm bearings in after I switched away from the 9mm bit, which was silly of me, but whatever. Once the dowels were all cut, everything was sized and calculated. I started by building one of the ends. And I do have to admit, when I was drilling the holes, I messed up a lot. I drilled stuff, I planned stuff out, I measured stuff, drew guides, decided, thought about it, and then when it came to actually drilling the holes, I just drilled them on the wrong sides. So I ended up with the panel that was initially intended to be on the left-hand side on the right and vice versa, which was silly. I was able to fill in the holes. It was like, when I did it, I was like, oh, well, I screwed up then. The project's over. Never mind, I'll just quit, do something else. But I was able to suck it up, and I put some wood filler in the holes I'd messed up on, waited for them to dry, coated them with a bit of PVA glue just to help hold the filler in and stop it crumbling if it was blown by a strong gust of wind. And in the end, everything worked out. I was able to drill holes in the right places, mostly, and hide most of my mistakes with filler. So yeah, I built one of the sides, which just involved hammering the dowels in with some wood glue, and then hammering the plank ends that were designated into those ends. And then I also drilled some holes and put a long piece of the spare dowel I had left over to act as like a little rail, and that's actually exceptionally useful because I'm using it for holding my clamps now, which is cool. After building the first side, I left it to dry overnight, and when I saw it, it was like, well, all these planks have actually started to turn into something, which was pretty cool. It was pretty cool to see that the project was starting to take some shape, and it felt quite positive to me. And anyway, once I built that one side, I was able to build the next side, and I glued that up. And then I thought, I can't build the whole thing today because I have to wait for some glue to dry. Because, well, glue doesn't instantly dry, and I didn't want to start sticking together long pieces while everything hadn't set together. So I didn't want to start bashing stuff and then stuff start popping out all over. That wouldn't have been fun. If I had loads of big clamps, I probably would have considered just clamping everything together and then whacking it anyway and getting it all built in one go. But I don't have access to that stuff as it stands. So yeah, I had to wait another night, I think, in the end. And then I was onto the adding the long pieces together. Once everything was dry, I just put dowels in all the places where the long pieces go. And I think what I did was I had one of the panels butted up against the wall originally. And I don't think I actually recorded any footage of this, which was unfortunate. I had the long pieces, which I was able to just sort of wobble onto the dowels on one end. And then I couldn't wobble them on the other end because they were all sort of stuck together, so wobbling wasn't an option. I was then able to sort of guide the other side panel, onto the big planks, and then I stood everything up on its end, got on a step ladder, and whacked it from the top, using the floor as the counterforce. And I got everything aligned in the end. Well, not perfectly aligned. The table's not perfectly square, but I got everything together, which was important. And then I left that to dry overnight, again, I think, which left me with the final bit, which was building a crisscross on the back just to act as extra support. Because once that was on, the frame itself was done. For the crossbar, I basically just ended up clamping down the wood from corner to corner approximately where I wanted it, marking lines, sawing it, using jigs. I found masking tape was really good at reducing how much wood split when I was cutting it with the saw. It still split a bit, but I mostly managed to minimize my mess. Like I say, I'm inexperienced at this. I don't know how to stop wood splitting super well. I think I want a different saw rather than a big chunky wood saw. But anyway. And then in the middle of each crisscross, I used a saw to chop halfway down, and I chiseled out. This is the first time I'd ever used a chisel as well. I chiseled out the middle section of each of those so that I could crisscross them together and squish them together and screw them together so that they'd sort of support each other somewhat as well. And I got one half of the crisscross perfectly sized, and the other half somehow came out short despite, being done at the same time, but it's not the end of the world. I screwed it together and it's still holding, and the table's rigid, which is good. And yeah, I'd originally planned to screw together the middle section, and I did, but the screws must have stripped out the wood, or I drilled the pilot holes too big or something, and they didn't hold. But the glue did, because I put some glue in between them, and if I wobble it now, they still move together. So the glue's holding pretty well, which is good. And yeah, once the crisscross was on, the frame itself was done. After I had assembled the main frame, I did stick some metal L brackets on just to add some extra support. I don't think I actually needed them specifically, but it just felt like a bit of safety insurance to just make the frame slightly more rigid. And so I believe the next thing I did was I screwed on some large boards onto the bottom, which is where the wheels will mount, and then I just varnished everything. And once the varnish had dried, I drilled holes and put the casters in, and then I was able to put the top on. The top I'd pre-finished 3 of the 4 sides, so that I could like screw it on and not worry. And then once the top was screwed on and everything was vaguely square, I sanded the top until it was smooth and soft, and I was very happy with it. And then I varnished it, and after it was varnished it became rougher again, so I sanded it back down, and it's now really nice smooth. I didn't sand down the bottom shelf. It's quite rough feeling, but I'm not working at it constantly, so I didn't worry about that. The top surface though is nice and feels good to work at. And once everything was all sanded and flat and varnished, well, it was done, and I'm actually really pleased with it for my first table project. Once everything was done, I did add a couple of screws so I could stick this multi-gang on so I can plug a few tools in, and then 2 USB ports so that I can charge my phone or have a light on when I record videos at the table, which is excellent. I think it's time to talk about things that either should be different or just went wrong. So I do have to put this in advance that if ever I come looking back at this video again, I'm like, well, I did a terrible job there. It's important to remember that I had very limited skills, very limited tools, and very limited money. So I honestly think I actually did the best I could with this table. However, if I could magically go back with what I've learned from this, there are some things I'd like to improve. Some pieces of wood weren't cut perfectly flat, so there were some gaps. They were still strong, but I had to hide my mistakes with wood filler, and if there's a mistake, hide it with wood filler. And there are some bits that aren't quite square. I think if I had better squares and some big clamps, I probably could have made stuff more square, but, no tools. Yeah, I think generally the positioning of stuff was quite good. I did a fairly good job of that, and I got the dowels in good. There was a bit that had somehow twisted the dowel alignment, even though I used the same jig and the same clamping technique for everything. Don't know how that happened, but it didn't cause any fundamental failures. Obviously, I wish I hadn't drilled holes in the wrong places. That was just silly. As for other changes, I would probably have used some hardwood. The wood for the legs ended up being really soft, so if I drilled it, it would sort of just crumble. And the top is a bit soft. If I clamp stuff to it, it squishes a bit. The side planks and stuff, they actually seem to be quite good. They're quite nice, but they were more expensive gram per gram of wood as well, so kind of makes sense. I think it was made generally of pine and spruce. I think the top panels, the tabletops are supposed to be spruce, and then the legs, I think, are pine, but they're really soft. So, yeah, from that point of view, I would have liked to have used better wood, but even if I had access to better wood, the shop I got the wood from didn't have harder woods, but even if they did, I don't think I'd have had the money to get them. So, again, something I would have liked to have changed, but couldn't change. Yeah, I think that's basically it. Just limited skills led to poor alignment. Sizes were actually quite good. But yeah, aside from the lack of squareness and straight edges, I think generally it did alright. Soft, not super square, it had some gaps. Yeah, that basically sums up the problems. So at this point, I've talked about what I wanted from my table, how I built it, and what I'd change if I really could. But now I think it's time to talk about what comes next. Well, obviously now doing my projects will be a lot easier, but there's a few projects that I want to do to the table first. The first thing I want to do is I want to add some more storage to it, because currently there's the surface and the shelf, and it's not really very space efficient. One of the things I want to do is I want to add a tool rack to the side, so I can have quick access. The inner panels, the panels that are sunk slightly further in, they're the perfect height for me to have a handle sticking up from to just grab without having to bend down or anything. And then the rails below obviously hold my clamps and stuff. But I need some tool holders, so I'll be working on that soon with the 3D printer. And I want some other 3D printed bits that help hold stuff too. And then there's a couple of tools that require the table as well that I want to work on. So little tease on the screen, hopefully. Yeah, I'm quite happy with it. If you've watched through this far, thank you so much. And I'll see you later. Okay, thanks, love you, bye.